Welcome to the Patrick Coffin Show. The culture war is not really just about small government versus big, high taxes versus small, the Second Amendment, all those are important questions. The culture war is about sex. We're going to talk with Dr. Anthony Esolen about his new book, Sex in the Unreal City, right now on the Patrick Coffin Show. This episode brought to you by Covenant Eyes. Go to covenanteyes.com. If you want your porn use to go to zero, my name, Patrick, gets you 30 days for free at the checkout at covenanteyes.com. That's Patrick. Try out this bad boy for 30 days. No one has ever circled back to me to say, this is a ripoff. It doesn't work. It is excellent for blocking pornographic content, as a software ought to do, but it's also accountability software. It sends everything you search for, every keyword, every search, every page, and you can't trick it out with any kind of incognito modes to a third-party email. So we love it. All our devices here in Coffinland have Covenant Eyes on them. CovenantEyes.com. My name, Patrick, gets you a free trial membership. Hit the subscription bell if you're listening on YouTube. Let the message come to you. The show drops every Tuesday morning. And check out coffinnation.com. As promised, my guest is back to the Patrick Coffin Show. Anthony Esolen translated the modern library edition of the Divine Comedy, as well as the Johns Hopkins edition of Tasso's Jerusalem Delivered. He's written over 14 books. He's written poetry. He's taught at university since 1987 and currently serves as professor of literature and writer in residence at Magdalen College of the Liberal Arts in New Hampshire. Tony, so great to have you back.
Great to be back, Patrick.
Sex in the Unreal City, like the subtitle, The Demolition of the Modern Mind. This is a collection of essays you had written before and kind of polished and crystallized and reframed. Is that correct?
Well, at first was to collect the essays and tweak them a little bit. But as I got into the book, I began to see that, in fact, it wasn't going to be the collection of essays after all. I would use maybe about a dozen or so of the essays as kernels for more meditation, more discussion of the issues that they brought up, and weave them all together as essentially a new book. So probably about 60% of the material in it is entirely new, and of the rest, it has been pretty heavily revised. So. And I can't keep up with the insanity of our times. I wrote this before the recent outbreak of mass madness that is the Antifa business here. We're to believe somehow that we are all living in a world of To Kill a Mockingbird and worse.
In what way?
Much worse. That it's.
You mean systemic racism,
well,
so-called?
Yeah. And always I try to get people to look at reality, right? People say, well, they're oppressed, they're this, they're that. First of all, when people declare their bad feelings, I am really suspicious. I believe that most people tell lies when they say, I was offended, I was hurt, and so forth. Now, not all the time, but a lot of the time, it's a put-on. And not even a conscious all the time. It can be an unconscious put-on.
Right.
On your play acting. I'm looking at the world out there as regards these matters, and I say, look, one out of six new marriages in the United States is interracial. Nobody thinks twice about that, right? But back in 1967 in the show Star Trek, there was an interracial kiss, and it was groundbreaking because it was the first such in television history. Well, we don't live in that world anymore, okay?
Yeah.
And we don't live in the world in which a perfectly innocent man, obviously innocent, okay, abundantly good man, can get accused of raping a white woman who is obviously lying. and be convicted in a small town court. That's the essential plot of To Kill a Mockingbird. That's not the world we live in anymore. Exceptions notwithstanding, we live in a world now in which interracial violence is overwhelmingly black on white in the United States by margins of 5-1 and 6-1, and in which upwards of 3/4 of all black children in the United States are born out of wedlock. That wasn't true in 1950.
It wasn't even true in 65. Yeah, the Moynihan report, 23% in 1965. It wasn't even
65 when Moynihan sounded the alarm bell, because the rate had gone up from 18% in 1950 to about 35%, 30 to 35% when Moynihan wrote his report. And that triggered an alarm for Moynihan. For President Johnson, too, he accepted Moynihan's interpretation of things, that this was very bad, and he was ready to move forward with making sure that the welfare programs that he put in place did not make that situation worse. But he got mugged by the Vietnam War, and it never got off the table. Moynihan got mugged by being called racist. Well, in 1950, that rate was 18%. In 1900, it was 10%. Now it's over 3/4. What do we expect from people who grow up in that kind of chaos, especially a certain kind of young man, a certain kind of boy? They're going to turn to caricatures of manliness. This is not just true of blacks in the United States. It's true of such groups elsewhere in other countries where race is not an issue. So the working class whites in the UK, so we've got the same kind of thing. So you try to point these things out to people, and it's as if you were it's as if you showed up with two heads and you're talking about some other planet. People don't want to think about reality.
Right. Hence the title of your book, The Unreal City. We can segue not sideways, but forward in a slightly different direction from your book, The Attack on Boyhood. And to say, one way to say it is to say that 73% or 80%, whatever it is, I'll take your figure of 3/4 of black babies are born out of wedlock. Another way to say that is that we have a massive crisis of fatherlessness. So now we have at least 2 generations and counting of young men who are filled with rage, and young women who are against the father because they resent their own absent or abusive father. Look at that. 2 of the 3 foundresses of Black Lives Matter are lesbians who were abandoned by their fathers. They hate their fathers. So, you've forgotten more Latin than I'll ever learn, but the last time I checked, the root of patriotism and patriarchy and the father is patrius, right? Patria, father? Pater, right. Okay.
Father,
So this smash the patriarchy is a code for smash the father in resentment and revenge. Am I overplaying the card?
Yeah. No, I don't think you're overplaying it at all. And by the way, when you bring up the word resentment, I have a book for everybody to take a look at, translated from the German. It's Max Scheler's book, around 100 years ago now, called Ressentiment. So it's resentment in French. It doesn't mean exactly the same thing as our English word resentment. So it's Ressentiment. And he shows how that's kind of a weird dynamic that goes on when you're gripped by this spiritual disease of ressentiment. There's some good thing that other people enjoy that for some reason or other you can't enjoy.
Yeah.
And it doesn't just make you vindictive and spiteful, that happens to you along the way. You reach a point where you invert your ideals themselves, so that it's not just that you're envious of people who have a good father. You hate the very idea of having a father at all, and you believe that the inverse is actually the good thing. To be fatherless is to be good. And this we see in the Black Lives Matter uh, 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 they're bent on destroying the patriarchal family. Oh my gosh, it's already been destroyed. Blacks in the United States, how much more destruction can there be? They desperately need patriarchy, right?
Right.
But the people who are running the show there have inverted their values, so that now what would have been considered by ordinary people in every single culture in the world, every human culture, what ordinary people would have considered a bad thing or a crazy thing. A bad thing to have a boy without a father, a crazy thing to pretend that boys can be made into men without the direct agency of men every single day, right?
True. Let me ask you.
They've now
Yeah.
said bad, but the chaos that we now have is a positive good.
True or false? Women can impart masculinity to their sons.
No sane woman says so. Okay, not in any very great numbers, right? I mean, every once in a while you get something that looks like an exception. So the old baseball player and football player Bo Jackson, who seems to have led a fairly good life, he had a single mother who was a very strong woman who insisted on proper behavior from her sons, and they got through. Now, it's not an ideal thing even at the best, and most people are not going to be Mrs. Jackson. Okay.
Right.
Okay. In large numbers, the answer is no. In even modestly small numbers, the answer is no. Why should we expect it to be that way? I mean, can I impart womanhood to my daughter? I don't know the first thing about it in my person. I can only observe it. And these days, if it was ever possible in a bad situation for a woman to make a man out of her son, maybe she was a widow. In our time, everything is against her. Okay, she can get no help from anywhere. Not from the mores of the whatever you want to call it that's around her. Not really a culture. She's not going to get any help there. She likely doesn't have a big, strong, extended family full of people who live nearby that can be seen every day. So then she's not going to get help there. Mass entertainment gives her no help. The school gives her no help. So if it was marginally possible in the past, most of that margin is gone. The answer is no.
How much, well, let me quote from your book, and then I'll ask you a question about one of the drivers, or one of the engines of the unreality. You say, we dwell in unreal city. We all dwell there. We have all been dulled and deadened by the unreal. But if God is real, then to turn away from God is to leap into unreality, and that is pretty much the definition of evil. Unquote. How much has the rise of contraception, its availability, its default acceptance by everyone everywhere, been an engine for this unreality and the flight of fathers from family and the rise of porn and everything else? Is there a co-starring role played by contraception in all this?
Yeah, there is. And I devote a decent part of a chapter in the book to that. One of the things that I didn't know when I wrote the original essays, because I hadn't started collecting these things, was that there was a group of pretty prominent Christian progressives in the 1880s, 1890s, and then turn of the century. They wrote for my favorite all-purpose magazine, the Century magazine, about which I've written in various places, and I've come across their work there. These are progressives in this sense. They are suspicious of the Industrial Revolution. They do believe that Christianity has to have a leavening effect all through the world, in their own nation, the United States, but then elsewhere too, and in those parts of the world that they're just now being evangelized, right? So they're looking forward, these Christians are, but they're looking forward with some trepidation and some flat-footed common sense. They've seen that the Industrial Revolution has posed challenges to the family that nobody had ever seen before, right? I mean, simply wasn't the case that the father in the family was removed from sight of his children for most hours during the day for 6 days out of the week. That wasn't the case. People didn't live like that. Now, once they were living like that, so these progressives were concerned about that. They also saw that the family was being constricted in its influence more and more. They were even wary of Sunday school because that would take another function from the family and place it elsewhere. They asked real questions about what would be good and what would not be good for the family, and they saw the family as the fundamental social institution, right? So these people are the same people who allied themselves with the first round of anti-porn people in the United States and anti-contraception people in the United States. These are in the same group. Anthony Comstock is the great crusader of the turn of the century against pornographic videos, because as soon as you invent the picture machine, you get porn.
Yeah, he was, right? Important to note, he was a Calvinist. He was no friend of the Catholic Church either. This is not a Catholic dogma thing.
But he got a lot of allies from them, and so and Comstock was considered a hero by both parties. He had bipartisan support, kind of almost universal support among the American people, and all these states passed Comstock laws against pornography, public obscenity, and contraception. And it was one of the Comstock laws that the Supreme Court struck down in the 1960s, in that case, Griswold versus Connecticut.
Yeah.
The early Christian progressives, before the progressives turned sharply secular, they understood these things. They understood that they lived in a real world, right? Right? That if you introduce into that real world with real fallen human beings, okay, this thing that appears to render sexual intercourse infertile and to be reliable about it. If you introduce that into the world, the rest of it is not going to remain the same. It's going to have a radical effect on everything else. And they were sensible enough to ask, what is that effect going to be? And do we approve of that? Okay. And the answer to them was, it's going to have a dreadful effect upon marriage, and we don't want it to have a dreadful effect upon marriage. We don't want people shacking up. They would have been sensible enough to see that it would not necessarily make unwed births go down, right? They in other words, they had brains. They say, well, just because you make that move on the chessboard doesn't mean that your opponent hasn't a move in reply. If you change this, well, then people will start to behave in a different way.
It's interesting that,
and we saw that in our own time. Paul,
what's that?
Paul predicted it. He knew
certainly
you make contraception readily available, you can expect to have more children born out of wedlock.
Yeah, he's definitely been vindicated as a prophet. It's interesting that the concerns that you're saying were laid down and raised, to change the metaphor, by Christian progressives 110 or so years ago are the issues that today's traditionalists are concerned with. It's been an odd inversion of the camps that are now looking at these kinds of things with a sense of worry. Yeah. I'm talking about from 140 years ago to about 110 years ago. And about 110 years ago, you can start to see a sharp turn towards secularism. Okay, before that interval, these are guys who are reading Pope Leo XIII, right,
and considering him an ally, right? Because they saw, you know what, we're all really talking about social reality here, and that starts with the family. And it was remarkable to see a bunch of Protestants reading Leo and other of the Catholics at the time and understanding that they were engaged in a very deep way with questions about the nature of society itself.
Yeah.
Right. It's very rewarding to read these guys.
I'm very interested in bookends and before and after snapshots, and it seems to me that the longish run enjoyed by the Century is a great before photo of where we were. You start chapter 1, Unreality 101. I'm looking at a book. It's hefty, cloth bound, more than 1,000-page, 2-columned pages with print that's smaller and smaller, plenty of black and white pictures. Inside it, I find various forms of man's encounter with reality, including the reality of his own being and of God. Readers were expected to know who Shelley, Keats, Wordsworth, Tennyson, Arnold, Mrs. Browning, Hugo, Goethe, many others. So the Century was not a Christian publication, obviously. When you pick it up, you can tell it doesn't have a formally evangelical purpose, but it does presume that the Christian faith is the best possible default setting for Western civilization, and it's on Team Christian, if you will. Tell us, just for folks who don't even know what the Century is, because you start the book with it. I think it's an important starting point.
It's a fascinating thing. I began to collect these about 15 years ago. Imagine that you live in a time where there are no paperback books. There are no mass marketed books. They're starting to see it trickle in with the so-called penny dreadfuls, really cheap and sometimes kind of sleazy novels. But otherwise, books are pretty costly, and therefore they were more treasured. You have your little town. You want your little town to have a library so that people could go in there and read books without necessarily having to buy them themselves. In these big literary magazines, the Century was one. Scribner's, Harper's, there are others, right? And I collect them in batches of 6 months, so they would be bound in a hardcover volume. 6 months worth, right? You go into the magazine, you find everything. There are short stories. There's light verse, sometimes more serious poetry. There are serialized novels. So if you're a kid and you're reading Huckleberry Finn in the 1880s, I guess it was 1870s, you're reading it in the Century magazine
as a serial, like the works like Dickens did.
Yeah, exactly the same, right? Twain published in the Century. That's where you would have been reading a Connecticut Yankee in King Arthur's Court, or Huckleberry Finn, or Tom Sawyer.
Yeah.
Okay. Henry James, same thing. All those big guys. That's how you're reading your novels. But there would also be essays on American politics, on religion, on how to interpret scripture, on new scientific developments. 15 pages on the Crab Nebula. Right? Maybe a 20,000 word essay on the new dam that they were building a little bit upriver in the Hudson in order to bring drinking water to New York City.
Right.
The new Croton Dam, right? I mean, technology is there. Everything that you can imagine is there. And you can find something to read even if you're as young as maybe 10, 11 years old. You might be reading Huckleberry Finn. But many of the articles are clearly aimed at people who are pretty serious about philosophy and the arts. The Century ran a 5-year-long series of reminiscences of the Civil War. We don't have anything like these magazines. It required a lot of attention to read one, and you learned a lot. If they're quoting a passage in French, they don't even bother to translate it. They figure if you're reading this essay, you don't need
and we're not talking
to insult you.
We're not talking to readers.
You don't read French,
right? They're not college grad readers by and large either, right?
No, most of these people are. The Century had a subscription level of 200,000, and you got to imagine about 10 readers per issue. If it just goes into a household, if it goes to the local library, it might be 50 or 100 readers per issue. So we're talking about millions of people reading in a country of about 70 million people. Mm-hmm. Nothing like that now.
Yeah.
I doubt very much that most college students would be able to read to read one of these issues with any ease, and college professors mm-hmm. would be a little bit put on their toes by it, right? Yeah. Professors themselves. So we go from there to our newspapers now, which aren't even worth lining bird cages with. Mm-hmm. They're linguistically simplistic. There's not much interest in getting at the subtle truth about anything. The writers don't seem to have any very great fund of general knowledge. And it all caters to an immediate impulse in the consumers, right? Mm-hmm. Everything is a commercial. Basically, everything is commercial. Political debates are commercials. Newspapers are commercials. It's just quick, fast, down and dirty, trying to sell you something. Yep. It's not real.
There's a book by Jerry Mander called 4 Arguments for the Elimination of Television. And he points out that this is a book in the 70s, maybe even the 60s, that television exists for the commercials. Commercials pay all the bills of television. So the chunk of time you're being sold things, that's why the platform called television exists. It wasn't to watch Merv Griffin or Dick Van Dyke or Jack Parr. It was to have things sold to you. Otherwise, no one gets paid, and voila, no TV.
Amazing, though, that you mentioned Jack Parr. He was terrific.
Fantastic. He's my mentor.
I met him the greatest comedy. Yeah. For a while, the people who ran TV had this funny idea that they could use television, for instance, to bring the Playhouse into the living room. Mm-hmm. So for about 10 years, we had things like Playhouse 90 and Texaco Playhouse. And some of those scripts were really fine, like Rod Serling's script, A Requiem for a Heavyweight. That's a first-class script for a play. Mm-hmm. Made it to a television show and then a movie. But those days are past.
Yeah. A big shift in toward unreality or toward using TV as a political tool came with Norman Lear and his very out-of-the-closet desire to influence the masses toward the Democratic Party of politics, starting with the character of Archie Bunker, which was meant to lampoon conservatism, but it kind of backfired because the writing staff gave Archie all the best lines.
They did. They knew which side their bread was buttered on, and people did fall in love with Archie. But, you watch those shows now, and the politics of it all, it seems incredibly dated. What in those shows is of an enduring value is it endures despite the politics. Mm-hmm. Right. And I think the same way about a lot of the stuff that went on in the church at the same time. It's so dated now.
Yeah.
It didn't drink from the well springs of classical and Christian tradition or even of reality. It looks silly and of its age, and the age has passed. I tried to watch the movie Godspell a couple of weeks ago and couldn't get more than 5 minutes into it. A bunch of silly young people led by a hippie start dunking each other in a public fountain.
Yeah, that was Victor Garber.
Yeah.
Victor Garber.
Yes.
There's a newer version of it.
I guess.
There's a newer version of it, which is musically much more complex and better. But still, it's kind of the story seeking a resurrection. Strikes me as kind of gay, too, the whole vibe of the film. You know who Marvin Olasky is?
Yeah.
So Olasky, the editor of World Magazine, he went to a Christian Book Association conference once. Like 40,000 people show up to this thing. It's huge. And he was looking at all the kitschy kind of cheese ball products, bumper stickers, T-shirts, and so on. And he came away with a phrase I thought was Do you know what I'm about to say?
I don't think so, but when you say it, I might recognize it.
Well, it's very Chestertonian. He said all the products and services sold at the CBA were of the world, but not in it.
Oh, that's great.
Isn't that great?
I've used that phrase.
Oh, yeah. I first heard it from Marvin Olasky.
To think that we go, let's take it from the Catholic side, right? We go from Michelangelo and Palestrina and Torquato Tasso and Blaise Pascal to what?
Jim Martin.
Felt banners hung in your church. Dan Schutte, dreadful. I mean, it's what happened to it all, right? I've just been reading a book about the Middle Ages by the Italian novelist Eugenio Corti, who wrote a big epic novel called The Red Horse. And Corti quotes the great medieval art historian Émile Mal as saying that, when you have to imagine in those days when there was a great feast, let's say at Chartres, but really any place in Europe, you had the church full, back-to-back, people standing back-to-back, rich and poor, right? All classes, all walks of life, right? All ways to keep body and soul together. And they're there as a unity. They're the body of Christ, the Church of God, and they share equally in some of the world's greatest art. They're there. I mean, you're just a peasant, and you have, because you're in church, a direct experience of art that is some of the greatest, in many ways, the greatest that the world has ever known. There's nothing comparable now. I believe Pope Benedict once said, or his brother once said, how did we go from Johann Sebastian Bach to this?
Yep. How much of this unreality that you put your finger on in the book is related to the dearth of beauty and reverence and just basic obedience to the letter of the canon of Mass? How much of this problem is at the back of it all liturgical in nature? It's kind of like a spiraling descent into inanity, right? Is that just a quick pause? Do you mean DISSENT or DESCENT?
Well, I had meant DESCENT.
Okay.
You start by having at best, C.S. Lewis put his finger on this in The Abolition of Man. You have at best a rather tenuous grasp of aesthetic ideals, right? Already that your hold upon beauty is getting shaky. Okay, this is true of modern man, not just true of the post-Vatican II Church. True of modern man, right? So you're beginning from a bad position. Okay, from that, you then begin to experiment liturgically. And you have no very great sense of beauty to begin with. In fact, you're not even quite sure that beauty exists at all. And so with very, very poor standards in art and music, or no standards at all, you sort of flail about. And if to put the nicest spin on it, you fall prey to what is merely pretty and sentimental, okay? And you don't see the difference between that and what is sublime. And I'm not talking about styles here, because the sublime can be found in traditional folk songs, love songs. You can get the sublime in, okay? So I'm not talking about style here. I'm talking about aesthetic ideals that are realized or not realized. That's at the best, and at the worst, you go for what is frankly sick and destructive. And people get used to, at best, the banal, the pretty, pretty and somewhat less than pretty. They get used to that, and once they're used to that, they resist any suggestion that they're ignorant when it comes to these things. And I don't see how you crawl out of that hole. You have to. Somebody from outside of that hole has to reach down and get you. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Aesthetically and intellectually. Hence, there's plenty of work in that vein for us at Catholic colleges, like mine, the Magdalene College of the Liberal Arts, and we just go further and further down. So, to think that a song that's as unsingable by a congregation as Eagle's Wings.
Just going to say Eagle's Wings.
It's now it's a terrible song. It's a terrible song. But people say they're so moved by it because they remember it from childhood now. I understand that kind of feeling, but they have no idea what that stuff has supplanted.
Yeah, that's a good point.
And that's at the best. At the worst, it's complete inanity.
Do you know who came up with the phrase, beauty is in the eye of the beholder? What's the origin of that? Do you know?
I don't know. I don't know if it can be attributed to a single person. That sense has that's coextensive with mankind. Okay.
Mm.
And there's a certain truth to it, qualified truth.
Yeah.
Right. In Latin, when they say "de gustibus non est disputandum,"
mm-hmm.
there's no accounting. There's no disputing about tastes. Okay. If we're talking about whether somebody prefers the statues of Praxiteles to the statues of Phidias, or vice versa,
mm-hmm.
you might say, yeah, I mean, there's something there that really does depend upon the individual's intellectual and aesthetic apparatus, right?
Yeah.
So that one person is deeply moved by Cervantes, another person less so, but would prefer to be deeply moved by John Milton. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
And right. So really, not in a certain sense, it's going to be true. In another sense, it'll be true too. That is, we experience beauty subjectively. Okay.
Yeah.
It's not something that you can measure in the same way that you measure the height of a building. Its experience is always inner to us, right?
Mm-hmm.
But its existence is objective, and we really do need to insist upon that. Beauty is an objective truth. It's a fact. And if we lose that sense, Abolition of Man, to read Lewis's Abolition of Man, we lose that sense, we lose mankind.
It's just been used when it's been jettisoned from any connection to the objective quality of aesthetic principles. It's been used to flatten or to liken Michelangelo to Robert Mapplethorpe or Andre Serrano, right? Just to justify the worst dreck imaginable.
And I throw it right back in people's faces, okay? Because I say, are you really telling me that Mozart's The Magic Flute is no greater a work than Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star?
Yeah, or Ice Ice Baby.
Are you really telling me that? Okay.
Yeah.
And I say, listen, if you want to argue for the aesthetic merits of X, okay, one bed, two bodies, that song, right? One bread, one body. Sorry about that. You may have to edit that out.
Freud, you
if you
slipped.
Want to argue for the aesthetic merit of that hymn as a poem and as a song for a congregation, argue for it. Argue for it. Let's have your arguments, but don't come to me and say, well, this is just what you happen to prefer, or there's no accounting for taste. I'm not going to take that. I wouldn't take that from a sophomore in high school.
Mm-hmm.
That's a sophomoric argument. Okay, it's a way to avoid discussion. You want to defend it? Go ahead, pal. Try to defend it. Okay.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But as soon as I say, people immediately back down. They say, well, you were just being snobbish and so forth. But they don't want to get to the reality of things. They don't want. Instead, they just want to attribute bad motives to you.
Mm-hmm. Or good art is that which gives me good feelings. Bad art gives me bad feelings, no matter who the artist is or what the piece of art is. One of the people you quote, Tony, is Walter Ong, another St. Louis Jesuit, ironically, orality and literacy. And I think Father Ong's insights into writing versus speaking, I think he's been vindicated as seeing somewhat around the curve. He was writing, 50s through the 70s, something like that. Let me just quote what you say. Already in the 1960s, Walter Ong, S.J., in Orality and Literacy, noted that in American colleges, the masculine virtue of courage and free fighting in the pursuit of truth was being set aside in favor of the expression of feelings and the championing of political ideals. That was a long time ago. We're no longer talking about a patient burdened with a parasitic disease. We're talking about an enormous parasite that has engulfed what used to be a patient. That's there's a lot compressed right there.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, think about it this way, right? Let's suppose that let's suppose that you were in a football locker room. Everybody is more or less relaxed. It was a practice day. Practice is over. The guys are just hanging out for a while. Okay.
Yeah.
And in that environment, they get into an argument about something. X. Okay. Whatever X may be. No opinion is going to be ruled out of bounds there. Right.
Mm-hmm.
You say, well, this is what I believe about X, and here is why. And somebody else says, well, you're wrong about that because you are saying something that something is factual, but it's not factual at all. This is in fact the case instead, and you get arguments. The arguments never focus on what this makes me feel. They are focused on, is this true? Okay. Mm-hmm. And in that environment, if you play the I feel bad card, or you made me feel bad, you lose face with the guys. You look like an idiot.
Yeah.
They don't want to talk to you then. That's an illegitimate card to play. That's 15 yards and loss of down. Okay. It may even be 15 yards loss of down, and you're out of the ball game. Okay, go sit on the bench, because we don't do that kind of thing here. We don't care about your feelings. We don't even care about your motives. A bad man may have bad motives for promoting what is in fact true. Okay, it is entirely possible. And what he is as a person and what his motives are not germane to the issue, which is this thing true? Okay. Mm-hmm. And a person may have all the best motives in the world and may be a good man, and he may still be wrong, right?
Yeah.
The thing that he is promoting may be false.
Yeah.
Now that is almost impossible to have in any sector of American society, that kind of discussion. Almost impossible. Certainly isn't to be had on our college campuses.
Well, now I have to ask you another question, because now we're in a post-truth world, whether on or off campuses, where truth itself is no longer anything transcendent, anything solid, lasting, eternal. Now truth has been redefined as my feelings. Right?
Yeah, well, we might as well close up shop, right? Feelings don't build a bridge. They don't fly an airplane. They don't trench a harbor, clear a field. How many times do I have to say such things? Your feelings are not to the point. And most of the time, and this I do say in the book, people lie about their feelings all the time, especially their bad feelings.
Mm-hmm.
You can't trust people who assert that they are feeling a bad thing, especially when they're in the midst of some argument or other, right? But in any case, to the question, truth, feelings are neither here nor there. If we don't believe in truth, then I don't know what the heck we spend all those billions of dollars on education for. What's the point of it all? Very expensive credentialing process. Get rid of the credentialing process, then we'll save all the money. Save all the money. Start going into your line of work when you reach the age of 18 or 19, right? If college is not for inquiry into the truth, then it is the worst swindle ever perpetrated upon man.
Did this
gigantic swindle?
When you're talking, I was thinking about John Dewey and Columbia and his lasting legacy on at least public education. It got me thinking about the college campus. Have American college campuses, Tony, always been bad idea factories? Have they always been sort of owned by or rented by the left? Or is that a post World War II, post sexual revolution reality? See what I'm getting at?
Yeah. William F. Buckley was already seeing a problem at Yale in the 1950s when he wrote God and Man at Yale.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And Dewey had gotten into the teachers' colleges by the 1930s. Okay. And a lot of bad stuff come out of the teachers' colleges. American textbooks fall off a cliff at around 1930, 1940. Mm-hmm. There's a huge difference between an English book in 1915 and the same English book in 1945. Huge difference.
What's the difference? How would you summarize that difference?
There's a de-emphasis on classical poetry and a de-emphasis on teaching grammar as a coherent system.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, the teaching of grammar becomes hit or miss, a little bit here and a little bit there and a little bit over there over the course of years, and a deliberate dumbing down of the readers so that the vocabularies in the readers are kept artificially narrow, artificially small.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what, and also they got this weird idea in their head that children learn how to read English in the same way that Chinese kids learn to recognize pictograms. So the teaching of phonics went out the window, and that produced a generation of kids who were just at sea when it came to read. That's the origin of the book, Why Johnny Can't Read.
Yes.
So Dewey did his damage, and there were a lot of things happening in American higher education that were not promising. Nevertheless, mm-hmm. When I went to Princeton from 1977 through 1981, and Princeton was heavily leftist, okay? Still, if you took courses in the liberal arts, you took courses that were being taught by people who believed they had something very important of the truth to impart to you, mm-hmm. and they were not going to change what they said or put a muzzle on their mouths for any political consideration. And in fact, the only course that I had in 4 years that had anything to do with modern politics was a course in modern politics. Right?
Yep.
Nobody talked about Carter or Reagan in an English class or a history class or something like that. They understood. They were scholars. They had important work to do. It was their work, and it was not the work of figuring out what our policy towards Iran should be, unless it was specifically a course on the Middle East.
Yeah.
Right.
Sure.
That began. That was flattened as with a flood in the 80s, as first you had women's studies and all the other politically defined programs, politically defined studies, hit all the colleges one after the other. And people brought up in that come in, and they can't do anything but political commercials.
Love to see if we could go back in time to show C.S. Lewis that in the future, not too distant future, he died in 1963, there would be whole college courses devoted to queer theory. And like, how would he react to that? I mean, it's just the parody and the reality are hard to. They've sort of mated and met together. So you've just given a before photo of Princeton. In the book, you describe your daughter's experience walking into Princeton. That's the after photo. Talk a little bit about that. The different priorities and what they hand to incoming freshmen.
Yeah, this was Providence College.
Providence College, right?
The student life at Princeton was not good. Okay, and at Providence College, when my daughter went to Providence College, graduated in 2010. The freshman orientation didn't have to do with the Catholic faith. Didn't have to do with, now we're undertaking this great work of preserving Western civilization, preserving the very idea of culture. Mm-hmm. It had to do with date rape and racism, and diversity and so forth. In other words, it was all political in that lame, naive, but yet oppressive and bullying sense, right? Everybody here has got to believe the same kinds of things about this stuff. She was sitting next to, I believe I mentioned it in the book, she was sitting next to a young guy, freshman from Nepal, who was really offended because he understood that he was being taken as a kind of mascot. You know?
Token brown guy.
I'm not a young man here. I am a diversity counter. He didn't like that. I wouldn't like it either if I were in his shoes.
That's the default. That's the new orthodoxy.
Yeah, it's diversity, and everybody's exactly the same. Lockstep diversity as the lemmings go over the brink.
You hear this a lot from people like Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. I've just heard it ad nauseum, and it literally is not true. Diversity is our greatest strength. You heard that mantra? What does it even mean?
Yeah.
Why?
Such wonderful, nice people. They'll buy any kind of bilge if it's portrayed as nice. In point of fact, if you look at countries that are always on the brink of civil war, it's because you've got groups in the country of relative numerical equality who hate each other. Homogeneous Iceland is not going to break into civil war because everybody's related to everybody else. But non-homogeneous Sri Lanka is always on the brink of civil upheaval. Same thing goes with Nigeria, right? There you have different language groups too. They not speak the same language. Their languages are not even the same language group. Okay, we're not talking about the difference between French and Spanish. We're talking about the difference between French and Chinese. Okay. And 40% are Christian, 40% are Muslim, 20% are pagan animists, and the Muslims hate the Christians, and the Christians try to defend themselves against the Muslims, and the Muslims hate the animists. Nigeria is a basket case because of their diversity, right?
Right.
Some empires have had diversity, ethnic diversity. The Roman Empire did. Most ethnically diverse political entity, I think, in the history of mankind. But the Romans were sensible about these things. You people over here, you can speak your language, but heck, you're going to do business. You're going to speak Latin in the West, you're going to speak Greek in the East. That's just the way of the world. Mm-hmm. You can have your religion, you dress the way you want. We don't care about any of that stuff so long as you pay taxes and you obey our laws. And if you don't, we'll come at you and crush you.
Yeah.
That was maybe the most successful experiment with ethnic diversity in the history of mankind.
And couldn't you say
the Austro-Hungarian Empire might?
Mm-hmm. I was just going to say, isn't the Catholic Church that principle of true diversity and plurality writ universal? You can go to any mass anywhere in any downtown area in almost any country. You've got billionaires sitting next to homeless people, various colors and languages, but it's not pluralism as an ism. It's plurality.
No. This is why I'm always amazed. I want to shake my head at people who try to talk to me about diversity. I belong to the Catholic Church. There's not a more ethnically and culturally diverse institution in the world, right? There were Vietnamese Catholics, Chinese Catholics, Brazilian Catholics, Catholics in American Samoa, everywhere, right? Mm-hmm. And most conservative Catholics that I know are dearly hoping that the next pope will be somebody like Robert Sarah from Ghana, from West Africa. Just as the same people were praying that it might be Francis Cardinal Arinze from Nigeria. You're talking to me about diversity? Come on.
Right.
You're a bunch of coddled, generally white people in the upper middle class and upper classes in the United States of America, and you're lecturing me about diversity?
Right.
Please.
Would you say
but we don't value that ethnic diversity for its own sake. It's a good thing that there's a multitude of human cultures, I believe. Mm-hmm. But we don't make a fetish out of that.
Right. Let's close with what to me is the apotheosis of unreality when you're talking about sex as act and as gender, and that is the transgender mania that has gripped our country. I just interviewed a very courageous Wall Street Journal writer named Abigail Schreier. She's a woman sort of maybe soft left. She does not have any problems with adults deciding that they're of the opposite gender. But this book, the subtitle of her book, the book's called Irreversible Damage, The Transgender Craze That Is Seducing Our Daughters. And already Amazon is not accepting any paid ads for the book. And it's scary, Tony, how gripped a generation of young girls are by this questioning that's been weaponized into thinking if you're the slightest bit wondering why you feel like a tomboy, you must be trans. And trans kids are to be trusted, and trans kids this and that. And the push to the total mutilation of their genitals, what makes them them, it's frankly scary because of how popular these influences are. Just talk a little bit about the trans mania as example of unreality, that we've all somehow we're all supposed to accept this as normal.
Utterly evil. And it's if you look at Milton's Paradise Lost and you analyze, or you try to analyze, the logic and the rhetoric of Satan's big speech, his big wallop of a speech to Eve to get her to eat that fruit, what you'll see is that by the time you're halfway into the speech, he's already contradicted something that he said earlier on. Mm-hmm. Imagine just a rolling series of rhetorical points that look like an argument, but they're actually heaping contradiction upon contradiction.
Yeah.
Milton knew what he was up to when it came to portraying evil rhetoric. That's what's going on here, right? Because On Monday, we are told there are no differences between men and women. Okay. Now, that's, of course, complete nonsense, but that's what feminists have been parroting for my whole adult life, right? No real difference between men and women. It's all socially constructed.
Mm-hmm.
So if there's no difference between man and woman, how can you possibly say that you know that you were a woman in a man's body or a man in a woman's body?
Right.
There are no differences, right?
Yeah.
It's like saying that you know that you are Napoleon and that there is no such person as Napoleon.
Yeah. That's the central contradiction.
I mean, we're not just talking about being wrong here. We're talking about a flat self-contradiction. It doesn't even rise to the level of a bad argument. We are supposed now to believe that not only is male and female different, which we all knew, but that somehow or other, you can actually be male in a female body and know that you're male in a female body when you have had absolutely no experience in your entire life of being male or having a male body. It's complete insanity. I don't know what it's like to be a woman because I have never had a woman's body. And no woman knows what it's like to be a man because she's never had a man's body. If we were to spend 5 minutes in the body, if it were thinkable, which it's not because we're body soul unities, right? But if you do a thought experiment, if you could spend 5 minutes in the body of the other sex, you would be floored, I think, by how alien it would seem to you. All right. A woman in a man's body, I swear she'd think that she'd been swaddled up in a callus. Insensitive to everything. I'd be afraid that she'd reach for a dish and grab it and crack it while she was grabbing hold of it, not knowing her own strength.
Right.
And this is insane even to believe of somebody who is 30 or 40 years old, right? But to believe that a 10-year-old kid or a 15-year-old kid can know this, and we know that kids are often troubled by delusions like anorexia. This is evil and cruel, and maybe Ms. Schreier will one day get around to noting that we are not islands, and what adults do sets standards, examples, maybe evil examples for children, for everybody else. So maybe it's not a good thing to let grown-ups do whatever they please when it comes to their bodies, because we're all in this boat together. You don't get to live your life as if you were on an island someplace in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. Liberals used to know.
Yeah, liberal itself has been redefined, hasn't it? The small L classical liberal versus today's leftism.
Yeah.
Well, I always enjoy talking to you, Tony. I always learn so much. I love this book. I was happy to blurb it. I think I described your writing as elegant sock to the jaw prose. Just follows in the tradition and the trajectory with your other books. I do hope it gets what it deserves, which is to sell out. It's called Sex in the Unreal City, The Demolition of the Western Mind. Anthony Esolen, thanks so much for joining us. I really appreciate your time.
Thanks, Patrick. So it's always great to be here.
You can pick up a copy of the book at patrickcoffin.media and find there much else besides. This is The Patrick Coffin Show. Be a saint. What else is there?
Hey, this is Patrick Coffin. If you like what you see and hear and you want to see and hear more, consider joining Coffin Nation as a full member. Just click right here and find out more about what that means. Nipsey, my fedora. That's Coffin Nation, the world's largest online community of culture builders. Click right here. See you on the inside.